We are recording. And it looks like people are already in here, so I'm just gonna start if that's all right with everyone.
Yeah.
Excellent. Welcome to How to Plan a Multi-Book Series. I'm very excited to chat with you all about this today as I'm embarking on this adventure myself for the first time. Obviously not like as we speak, but essentially as we speak. So please introduce yourself and tell us why you ended up writing multi-book series when writing one book is hard enough. Let's start with Elizabeth.
Okay, thanks, Diana. Hello, everyone. I write fiction and non-fiction, and in the context of today's panel, I wrote a series of thrillers set in the sometimes murky world of international pharmaceuticals. And I actually started off as a 6,000-word short story, and it sort of grew. And when I'd finished the first novel, I realised that the story wasn't finished. And it actually became a three-part series. So I hadn't actually intended to write it as a series, and that has implications for planning, which I'm sure we'll pick up on at some point during the discussion. But yeah, so I think it was a sort of an accident the first time round.
Who wants to go next?
I suppose I'll jump in here. I'm Catherine Olson. I publish under the name of Khaki Olson, a childhood nickname from my family. I write a lot of fantasy, a lot of retellings of fairy tales, but I don't think there's a single story out there that I have thought of that doesn't have the potential for either a sequel or isn't planned to be an actual series. My first publisher actually told me that it's best to be able to talk about your book as a standalone, but to have the potential for something else, and that's kind of the attitude I've always adopted.
Awesome. Yeah, I've definitely heard that that's recommended, especially in the traditional publishing world. Kate?
Hi, my name's Kate Borcherel, and I like Elizabeth, I write non-fiction and fiction, and I fell into multi-book series accidentally as well. So I do a lot of work around emerging technologies, which is a huge amount of fun. And I was asked in 2016, someone approached me to write a book about cybersecurity, a really serious one. And after a sort of 3 or 4 coffees, a couple of lunches, he said, can you do it as fiction? And I said, I can't write fiction. And he spent 8 months going, go on, go on, go on, go on, go on, go on. And eventually I woke up one morning with a scene in my head. So I wrote it down and sent it to him and went, like this. And he went, yeah, just keep writing. And so I started writing, and this entire plot just appeared. And I went to my existing publishers of nonfiction, and they said, no, we don't do sci-fi. And I found an indie publisher in my own hometown that publishes sci-fi and fantasy. And I'm like, well, that means something straight away. And the first question they asked was, is this going to be a standalone or a multi-book series? And I said, I've got no idea. I don't know what's happening. I know where this is going, but I've got no idea what happens. And I got to the end, and there was a minor character, and I couldn't work out what to do with him, so I killed him off. And then
as you do.
Then I just stopped because I'd run out of steam just about. It does end a little abruptly. And I left the body lying in a corridor, so I had to write the second one. The second one literally starts the next day because they've got to clean up the body in the corridor. And then there's been some interest in the second one, and I was asked, can you reproduce the magic? And I'm like, okay. So then I wrote the third one, and now I'm plotting out the fourth one. So it's been a bit accidental, but it's become far more scientific all the way through.
That's amazing. And can I say that we all need someone to encourage us like that? That guy on you for 8 months, that's amazing.
And he still does it, just to say because it's all emerging tech, and he's a tech guy, every single word I write, when I finish a chapter, I email it to him. and he comes back and goes, that's plausible. Have you thought about doing this? Have you thought about doing that? What about steganography? What about this technology? And it also means I know someone else has got a copy of the chapter in case everything goes wrong.
That's incredible. We could all be so lucky. Dan?
So you mentioned earlier or somebody mentioned earlier that the traditional advice is, pitched as a standalone with series potential, which is true, certainly true when you're creating agents. But I found it maybe is a little different with small publishers because my publisher in particular, Shadowspark, they clearly seem to gravitate toward trilogies. There's a lot of our writers are doing trilogies, partly because it's an enclosed thing, so they're not worried about, is this going to drag on forever and eventually readership would dwindle and then it just becomes a liability. And there's also something not wholesome, but something about the form of a trilogy that allows you to have a concrete structure like an arc that you would have in a book, where it could be harder if your series is very long to figure out what's the arc going to be, particularly if you don't know how long it is. So when I started writing the first book, I wasn't quite sure, but I sort of thought there might be more, but very quickly I discovered this is going to be a trilogy, and I kind of had an idea about what the trilogy arc would be. And I just recently kind of had a flash about what the next trilogy is probably going to be and how that arc would work. So I think I write trilogies. I'm currently in the process of publishing and editing one, and that idea of an arc is really important to me, and that's one of the reasons I think trilogies are a great form. And you don't necessarily have to hide the fact that you're writing it the same way if you're pitching to a small publisher as you would when you're pitching to an agent, because some publishers want that. Just it depends on what they're looking for.
Yeah, that's an important thing to consider. We'll talk a bit more about that later. We'll touch on the publishing side of things, but today I really want to focus on the craft, and specifically I want to talk about consistency. How do you ensure that not only your tone is consistent from one book to the next, but that your world building and character details are consistent from one book to the next?
Yeah, well, I'll dive in on that one, because I think, having said that I sort of fell into it accidentally, of course I couldn't plan in advance to get everything consistent, so I had to do it retrospectively. And for all my major characters, I write something like a 10-page backstory, sort of the classic, what colour hair have they got, what are their eyes like, etc., etc., and it just goes right through. And because I've got that as a background, I then can go back and use that to make sure I have consistency moving forward. But because I didn't plan it as a series, there were some places where I got things set in stone, which with hindsight I wouldn't have done that way. But because you're right, consistency is so important. You have to sort of live with what you've put there from the start. With the characters, it's fairly easy because you can keep a record of them. With venues, on my first trilogy, I set the first one in Southern Africa, the second one in Latin America, and the third one in Russia and Ukraine. So I didn't have to worry about consistency there. The series I'm just starting now is actually set in a fictional village here in South Devon. So in a way, it's similar to you guys who are sort of world building for your fantasy writing. And I'm having to be very careful because I know that's going to be a series. I'm designing the location very carefully so I can use bits for it as I move forward as well.
I think it was Kate who was saying that she had someone who was both encouraging her and pushing her. I have someone very similar. It's actually my roommate / a person who has her degree in linguistics but a minor in editing. And she has been very invaluable for me. She, throughout the entire process of creating a world, she will sit me down and just ask me questions for 3 hours at a time to make sure that I have everything thought out. But I'm trying to kind of branch away from that, not only because she has her own life, but because I need to be more self-reliant. in putting those kinds of questions down into my own notes, into my own documents, so I know at any time that I have a reference point. For me, a lot of it has to do with whether or not I know it's a trade phrase to use that my mother always said as a piano teacher, but she said, begin with the end in mind. So for me, at each stage of the book that is about to be taking place, or the book that is to follow, I know that there is an end goal, but I do also have to keep in mind what the thematic arc is for that particular story and how it progresses towards the end of the story.
Yeah, I agree with that. The sometimes you can't see the end for everybody, and sometimes your subconscious delivers the route that people take. But actually having that end in mind, it certainly with the first book, I knew where it was going, and I was just very surprised by the way that the subconscious just kicked in, and things happened that I wasn't expecting, which was just the most fantastic thing. I have this, which has been with me since the first book, and it's got, you know, sort of my each character's got their little page, and I sort of add to it as things happen. The worst one is going back through the previous books to make sure that they order the same coffee. Because I made the very first one, I'm like, oh, and Cameron gets an espresso, and Pete gets a cappuccino, and I couldn't remember which one it was, and so I have to read them back when I go to write the next thing and make notes on what I want to draw out. What I've found with this third one, though, is that I've now, when I went through it for the first, well, not the first pass, but the pass before I finally sent it to the editor to get their red pen out, I picked up on all the threads that I'm going to tug on for the next book. And that's a lot of fun. They're finished, but they've got things that you could poke at.
I have a Word document that I just kind of dump ideas in occasionally, particularly if I get a little bit stuck on writing. I'll just take a break from that and just dump into this document. But one of the things it has is names. So like this, in the trilogy there, you know, I don't know how many names, but a lot. And also place names and, you know, the names of creatures and, you know, some details that I might forget because I got so many characters. You know, one book has 13 point of view characters, and obviously I can keep them straight, but sometimes, you know, you have to think about that. So just keeping one document helps for consistency. And I also want to mention, I think consistency is important, but also with variety. So in the trilogy, I have different point of view structures in each of the books. So the first one is three rotating points of view. The second one is a kind of a relay. So, you know, one character and then into the next one in the next chapter, and they sort of move forward as a group moves forward into the plot. And then the third book is half from the protagonist and half from the antagonist. It kind of goes back and forth. So I feel like having consistency is good, but it's also good to have some variety so that your readers are going to be constantly discovering and surprised. And obviously some people really want, in certain types of books, I feel like rely more heavily on more predictable structures, and that you want that consistency. But I think, you know, depending on what you're writing, limiting your consistency can be a good thing. I don't mean that, you know, you shouldn't use the same name for a character or they should order the same coffee, but, you know, mixing it up enough that it's fresh and new, I think could be a good idea too. That's
a really, really good point, because there is a danger of, well, this is multi-book, so the first one worked, let's do the rest the same. Yes. And I desperately try to avoid that, but my brain doesn't appear to do it anyway, which is a real bonus.
I think a lot of the time when you see that, what's really happening is that the author is just using it as a cash cow, and they don't have the passion for the series that they did when they first started. Cough, Xanth, cough. And so eventually it just starts to feel like derivative works of the original books. I must say, Dan, 13 POV characters, that's a lot. I'm really tempted to derail this panel and ask how the heck he managed.
I can give you a one minute explanation. So
all right, go.
Please do.
At the end of the first chapter, whoever's point of view it is, this is third person limited, by the way, whoever they're with at the end of the first chapter, we follow that person's point of view into the next chapter. And then whoever that person is with at the end of that second chapter, we follow them. So you have a narrative continuity. And the bulk of the novel is told from 6 or 7 points of view. But at a certain point, one of them is captured. And so then after that, you get the antagonist point of view that they captured, and then you get to know them better until they come back together again in an interesting moment. So I call it a point of view handoff. And it seems to work pretty well. Like, none of my betas or editors have said a single thing about it. I was worried about all the points of view. It's not like you get 13 points of view at the same time. They're all together, and you know who they are before you get the point of view.
I think that's an interesting way to approach it. If I can jump in for a second, I'm a personal huge fan of J.R.R. Tolkien. And one of the things that he is notorious for, in my opinion, is that he has 2 consecutive books in which he leaves a character at a critical moment for 200 pages in which we don't know what exactly is going to happen to them. So I think that an essential part of keeping the drive and keeping it from feeling like a derivative part of someone else's or of your own work is to leave a little bit of uncertainty both for yourself and for the readers, so that you are compelled to come back and resolve what was unresolved at that point.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So something that wasn't 100% clear from the way you guys introduce yourself is, are your series in more individual adventures, or do you have a big overarching plot line? What does that series arc look like for you? Or is it really just you could keep putting books into the series as long as you care to?
But mine's fairly hasn't really moved from the original concept because it covers cybercrime, but that is a well of increasing depth and enormous fun, which generally relies on human error. So there you have your plot starting, and so the one thing that I had to do was to expand the role of the antagonists. So with cybercrime, you tend to have a faceless antagonist. So the first one had you couldn't see the baddie behind it, you could only see the damage. And then the comments that I got back were, but who's the baddie? So then I brought in a couple of characters, and that's really started to get things to pop. And then I've widened it out and gone, well, actually, it's Spectre, basically. There's one big organisation and lots of bits to it. So we're closing down one branch here and potentially opening another there. So I've now got a lead. I've got a lead antagonist with a face and a character and an empathetic sort of soul, and I've got the fringe around them. So I'm starting to end up with 2 teams, one fighting and the other one battling, and working on different motivations for each, so they're not black and white.
Mm-hmm. For me, it actually depends on the series. I have 2 that I'm working on creating. One is a series that actually the world entirely dropped into my head. I literally thought one weekend about what it would be like if social workers had to work both with the living and the dead, and all of a sudden I had this entire fictional town in Massachusetts where this is the state of beings, and it infected everything from the social interactions to the adoption process to the legal structure. And within this town, I have a million different stories. I even found out that a short story I had already written involving a Greek demigoddess who retires to live a happy mortal life with her husband, only to discover that he's about to be killed in a violent act. She is part of this greater storyline, but I also have a trilogy that I'm working on that still does not have a title, but it is entirely self-contained within the person and then the alter of a person with dissociative identity disorder. And so it's very different process of creating these 2 worlds. I know exactly who is going to have which perspective to accomplish the different things. And on the other hand, the series set in Mercy Grove, the fictional town in Massachusetts, that is something where I could go on for dozens of books because it's all different perspectives on how this town works.
And I started off because, as I say, my first book was intended to be a standalone, it does have a story that finishes within that one book. And each of the 3 books does have its own standalone story, but there is an overall arc as well. And one of the reasons I realized it was going to be more than one book was because although I'd solved the initial or the immediate problem in book 1, I hadn't dealt with the antagonists and sorted it out completely. By the time I got to the end of book 3, I'd sorted that out and we've closed that arc down. And I then actually took a year off writing fiction because I'd lived with those characters for so long. I needed a break before I started something else. And then when I started writing this new series a year later, I realized the characters wouldn't go away. So I've actually taken 2 of them. I've moved forward 8 years in time, retired them to Devon so they can carry on doing the sort of things they're doing, but in a totally different scenario.
That sounds like a really fun way to breathe new life into a series and a pair of characters. I love it. Dan?
I like what Elizabeth said about, having a complete arc within each book in a series. I think it's really important. I saw a book referred to by a book blogger on Twitter the other day as they were like, I liked it, but I hated the sequel bait. So sequel bait, I guess, being like, ending it at such a point where you don't really have a complete story, and like the only way you can find out is by reading the sequel. And obviously a lot of books have that structure, and I'm not trying to diss on anyone who does, but I personally find it appealing to have a complete story with a few unanswered questions at the end. So my trilogy is called the Mare Cycle, and it is in fact a cycle where the humans encounter another group called the Mare, who are basically like humans, but they just have hair all over their bodies. And over the course of the first book, they have some encounters and get to know each other a little bit in some difficult circumstances. And then in the second book, it takes place mostly among the Mare, and then they have encounters with another group, and the third book, and so on. So it is a cycle. Sort of the questions that are asked in the first book get explored more in the second book, and then sort of answered in the third. So each book has its own arc, its own adventure, its own set of stories, but it all does kind of close a loop. And that's another thing I like about trilogies. I feel like it allows for a certain narrative symmetry. I think we naturally think in threes, and somehow it works best for me anyway, right now.
Absolutely. I mean, there are actually quite a few series that, they're more than 3 books now, but they were released in sets of trilogies. The one that pops to my mind, because it's right behind me, is The Mortal Instruments. There are, I think, there were 9 of those, and they were released as trilogies, each set. And that's a really smart way to do things, because, yeah, our brains do think in threes. So when you're creating these books, how do you decide which threads you're going to carry over? I mean, obviously there's like the main, standalone plot to each book, but how do you decide which subplots need to close in a book? What character things you need to address in each book? How do you make those decisions?
Mine's all character led, so I want to see whoever the principal characters are in that book, because there are a couple of principal characters, but there are several sort of second tier who have their own point of view occasionally, and who are critical to the story. And I tend to bring, I'll think, what is the story behind this character, and I'll start to bring them out more. So it's very much character led of, where are they now? Where are they going? What are the pitfalls along the way? And actually building those character journeys informs the plot. And then you bring in all of the cybercrime side of things. And the other thing that I always look at is, where's the money? Because I don't, you can't do this, you can't do that sort of thing for no reason. So what are the reasons behind the attacks? Who's getting the money out of it? And that's every time that I feel that's really important, because they've got to have a motivation beyond being bad.
Yeah, And I mean, that's especially applicable to your type of book, but that's true for all books. It may not actually be money, but like the where's the money question, and it does have an impact. Who wants to go next?
When I started writing the books, one of the sort of the background triggers for me was the James Patterson's Women's Murder Club books, where he has 4 strong female protagonists, and occasionally kills one off and puts another one in. And one of those characters will be the main one in each book. It'll be a different character in each book. And I started off with 3 strong female characters, and each of the 3 books, a different one of those characters takes a lead, and the problem within that book is centered around that main character, but the others are sort of working in the background and working on the overall one. And I also have a group of antagonists who come in and out, and then they all come together at the end.
For me, I think one of the best ways that I kind of develop both character development and character motivations is to take a look at the beginning of the book versus the end of the series, what the life and death question is for this character. And it is something that can utterly and fundamentally change. For example, the one that I was talking about where it's a girl with a dissociative identity disorder, the life and death question in that book, as the very first chapter opens, is who killed her older sister? And in the course of going through the investigation of this and discovering a lot of things about the world that she's currently living in and the world she's about to discover, that is still the important question as to what caused this, but the more fundamental question changes completely. And so by the end of the first book, at the very least, she has the same fundamental desire, but the way that she is approaching it is very different. It also reminds me of J.K. Rowling and the Harry Potter series, where the overarching question in that series is, how is the wizarding world going to defeat Voldemort? But in each of the books, there's a different way of approaching this. In the first one, it is who is trying to steal the Philosopher's Stone. The second one is who has opened the Chamber of Secrets and how can they destroy the monster within. The third book is who is the prisoner of Azkaban. Is he ever going to appear on screen? You get the idea. And so there is a life and death question that you can keep at the beginning and the end, but throughout there are different ways of interpreting it. And I think it's a wonderful way to just kind of both talk to your character and to talk about the world that they live in.
Kate and Elizabeth both mentioned character, and Kaki mentioned sort of unanswered questions. And for me, that's the big deal, is you have, at the end of a book, what is the most interesting unanswered question from the first book? And that's going to be an important part of the plot of the next book. And also, who is the most interesting character that you didn't really get a chance to explore the most? So in my first book, you know, there starts with 3 points of view and they're all humans, but as they, at the end of the book, they get to know the mayor. I was like, well, the most important question is like, well, I can't quite explain that right now, but the most important characters were the mayor, who you only got to see a little bit. So I was like, really, the next book has to be from their point of view primarily, although it's kind of a mix. So I do agree with everybody, what everybody said. Most important question, most interesting character that didn't get enough page space.
I love that. That's actually how the series I'm working on right now has sparked. It's the most interesting character from my last book. So we do have an audience question that's more about craft. So I'm gonna ask that, and then I do have a couple of more businessy questions that I wanted to ask, just because multi-book series is a very specific thing. So in a trilogy, can books 2 and 3 be extensions of the same story but not standalone? I guess that's more like a how you would sell it to the publisher question. Like, do you then sell books 2 and 3 as standalones, or are you selling them as a series?
Can I jump in on this one?
Yeah, go right ahead.
So the reason I want to jump in is because this very question has come up with my publisher. So they contracted me for the trilogy after reading the first book. And then when I was pitching or was sending the second book to them, I was like, one of my questions is, should I be changing this book to make it possibly interesting as a standalone, or should I leave it as part of the trilogy? Because I thought maybe somebody doesn't want to read the first book, but the second book sounds more interesting to them. And Shadowspark said, definitely don't change it. You're writing a trilogy. A trilogy is already limited enough, so people are not going to be worried about, am I going to make a commitment to a 27 book series? No, they're not. They're like, I'm going to be making a commitment to a trilogy, and I get it all done within 6 months, and so it'll be fine. So none of the books in my trilogy are standalone, although you probably could read the third one standalone a little bit. But I think it's generally, maybe other people can disagree here, but for trilogy, I think it's not expected that the books be standalone. They should each have their own plot. So like, you shouldn't be left totally hanging and have no idea what's going to happen next. There should be some completion of arcs within the story, but I don't think standalone is expected in most trilogies.
I absolutely agree, but I suspect that the standalone aspect, that the trilogy aspect is the original characters have been established and the world has been established in the first book, and you don't have to revisit that in the subsequent books. I think that's possibly the distinction.
Yeah, in my case, I would have had to add a whole bunch of stuff that would have felt like, telling, not showing, if I had tried to make the second book standalone. So I was puzzling over like, how in the hell could I do that? And I was glad to hear that probably not worth it.
I personally think that I do like the idea of having standalones as each part of the trilogy or each part of this series, but as another fandom that I'm involved in is I'm a huge Star Wars nerd. This is kind of the thing that you will discover about me, is I can tell you my deep love for any given this series or trilogy or whatever. But in Star Wars, we have the first movie, which has a huge set of stakes, but it is essentially a standalone. And the third movie is a representation of how the first movie's stakes have developed. The second movie of the original Star Wars trilogy is actually my favorite. It's The Empire Strikes Back. And it's because we know the stakes that have to be resolved. We know the stakes that have evolved so far to a certain point. And unless there is a resolution to this, there is no use in having this movie, and it will drive you crazy until the end of time. And so I think that there are ways for second books and trilogies, or any middle movement in a work of a series or in a work of a single trilogy, where you can have it just enough unresolved that it has to be resolved, and that is what will keep both you and your receptive audience going.
Yeah, I think I agree with the others, actually. I think, and because I'm an indie publisher, my publisher does what I ask them to do, so they want what I want them to want. So
That's always nice. It's nice to see eye to eye with your publisher.
Oh yes.
So that does bring me to another interesting question, though. How much back detail do you fill in when you're working on a second or third book in a series? How much do you reference stuff that happened before? Because it's not just for potential new readers. There's also the fact that, there's a time period between when your books are released. So, people will have had at least a month, 3 months, maybe even a year or two between reading each book. So how do you balance the need to keep everything fresh with filling in those details that readers might have forgotten?
I try to keep it as light as I can. I put details in if it's essential for the ongoing plot, but I don't put too much back detail in, because I think, as you say, it depends how close people read. I know if I discover a new author and I read them one after another, I get very irritated if I see the same backstory being repeated book after book. So I keep a very light hand on that.
For me, it's all about not necessarily doing what Anna Martin did with the Babysitter Club book, where every single book I could skip chapter 2 where they give the history of the Babysitter Club. But on the other hand, what you can look at is the consequences. A lot of really good crime series that I've read have done this, so that you see, you know, in the first book, we understand that this is something that happened, that the detective and his assistant have been able to solve this crime. In the subsequent books, we see how this has affected their working relationship. Or in one specific series I read recently, it takes 3 books for the secondary protagonist to actually admit that she has developed post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's something that we recognize throughout it, and the way that it manifests itself in terms of her panic attacks and her struggles and her nightmares is a callback to what we have learned in the last few books. And so I think that for me has been very effective in seeing how that can be stated without actually doing a recap.
I love that. Kate?
I was just thinking how I've handled that. I get annoyed as well. I don't like rereading the same thing over and over again. But I'll add to the backstory. So I won't repeat the backstory, but I'll add to it. So I'll, in one of the first book, you know, character A, you understand what their current family is, and you get to know them. In the second book, you understand why the parents are no longer there. In the third book, you see the family, the younger ones growing and a fallout. But I don't repeat the detail of the other bits because that's not important for that book. You can read that standalone, just understanding that this is a person who happens to walk past the graveyard. You don't need to know why. So yeah, that's not a really full answer, but
I would have two words to answer this. One is breadcrumbs, and the other is editors. So rather than leaving, like, you know, a whole loaf of bread, as Kaki mentioned in the Babysitter series in the second chapter, you know, you have a few breadcrumbs, maybe even the occasional like medium-sized crust, but nothing too big, and sort of sprinkled fairly evenly. But then how do you know how much is too much? And that's where editors come in. So when my editors looked at the second book, they're like, I think we could use, I'm always worried about giving too much because I know that's irritating. And the editors would be like, I think we could use a little bit more of a recap of X right here, or a little mention of this. And usually that mention or whatever is 1 to 2 sentences. And I would say they might happen, you know, periodically in the first, you know, 4 or 5 chapters, but not so much as to be irritating to someone who just read it. So editors are really good because you can't always see yourself, because you know the story so dang well that you don't know what people are going to remember and forget. And like, how could they forget this incredible thing that I spent so much time creating? You know, were they idiots? I don't even want them as my reader. No, it doesn't work that way. So the editors are great people to help you with that, with the breadcrumbs.
I would like to respond directly to the breadcrumbs thing. It's actually something that the first time I ever wrote a full-length manuscript with the mind of actually publishing it, it was my Swan Lake retelling, and it's set in 21st century Boston, which is where I grew up, or rather I was in the 20th century at the time. But there was a moment at which my first beta reader actually stopped and asked me this very specific question about Bostonian culture and traditions and superstitions, and all I had done was forget to explain this one particular peculiarity of something that happens on New Year's Eve. And as soon as I resolved that, that was no longer an issue. It was no longer an influencing part of the story. And we now have this running joke between us that if something is not clear or if something needs to be fleshed out, she will just say buttons. And we know that that is a moment where I have to take this breadcrumb and assume that readers are not going to automatically know what's going through my head at the moment. So that's my take on that. Please forgive me for interrupting the other person.
I get that a lot with my editor because, of course, emerging technology, and I'll go, this thing, and she'll come back and go, what?
Never happens
and then I
to
have
any
to
of us.
explain it for the layman in as narrative a way as possible.
And if I could just add something that, I mean, we've talked about the fact that our books are a series but can be read as standalones. If a new reader discovers us in the middle of the series, we don't want to give too much away because we'd actually quite like them to go back and read the first or the ones they've missed. So I think you have to balance that as well.
Agreed.
Yeah, in my case, I don't think it would work. That's why I go with the trilogy. Like if you started in the second book, you would be lost, but that's okay. There's only 3 of them, so.
Yeah. And I think it really depends on genre too. Like in fantasy, that's kind of the norm. Is you expect to have a trilogy, you expect the middle book to not stand very well on its own, and half the time to be not great in comparison to the other 2 either.
Harsh.
All right, so
Very
if
harsh.
the audience wants to ask, hey, I never said that was about you.
Oh, it's
no,
as
those
I can guarantee you,
stories.
it's 100% not true for me. The second book is definitely even better than the first.
Well, that's good to hear. So if the audience wants to ask more questions, they can. We do have some time. I'm going to ask one more question in the meantime. How do you sell books in a multi-book series? Do you do something big for the launch of each book, or do you just focus on, marketing book 1 and hoping there will be sell-through?
Okay, I'll answer that. There's two different ways. For my physical books, I do a launch party here in the town where I live, or at least I have done up until now. Not sure what's happening at the moment. And I use the local church because it's the biggest space we've got, and I always get musicians that are closest to the book. So I had African drummers, I had Latin American for the second one, and I had a Ukrainian singer for the third one. So I sort of have a party around that individual one, and I always find that doing that gets people to, new readers, go back to the beginning and work their way through. With the ebooks, what I will do is if I'm launching book 3, I will do promotions on books 1 and 2 in advance of the launch of book 3, again to just build up some of the razzmatazz, if you like, so that people, and also to get new readers ready for book 3.
I haven't thought it through other than getting signings organised. A lot of times the first book came out in time for my publisher to take it to New York Comic Con, which was brilliant. The second one I got in print in time to take both of them to South by Southwest to do some signings. So I've done stuff around having print, but nothing really formal. But the indie publisher that I work with also publishes a series of anthologies which are curated and royalty driven. People don't, you don't pay to be in them, you get royalties from them. And what they do each time each time an anthology comes out, the first one goes on promo, because that's the one that has got all the visibility, and it hit a #1 best. We had our pirate special came out a couple of weeks ago on Talk Like a Pirate Day, and the first one hit #1 in free on one of the categories, and it has a knock-on effect to all the others. It spikes all the others because I think there's 7 now. So yes, it's that associated promo. I've just put the prices of my first 2 up because my third one's on pre-order now, so then I can do the promotions from a higher point.
That's awesome. So a question, what are you going to do for the book that's on pre-order now? Because live events aren't as much of a thing.
I'm just spreading it around at every conference that I speak at Zoom.
Sounds good.
I should fling a link on, shouldn't I? Yeah, no, it has to be just networking and social media. I mean, I've actually spoken to Dan on Twitter. I've met and Elizabeth, you're on Twitter with me as well now, aren't you? So I'm all over social media, and I'm starting to write more blogs and that sort of thing. So yeah, just active and here.
Awesome. Kaki, do you want to speak to selling books in a series?
So far, in terms of actually publishing them, I do not have series published. I have had a book published and then a lot of anthologies. And so a lot of what I do in terms of marketing has to do with essentially comps. So things where I will say, I know that you enjoyed this aspect of this thing that I put out, or I know that you were interested in the exploration of this. Here is why you would enjoy something like this. So that is my main strategy, and I hope to put all of this into more practical effect once I actually publish things. But since I'm doing traditional publishing as much as possible, I have yet to go indie. I am going to hopefully just be able to do that once I sell it to a publisher.
Here's hoping. It is a tough journey, traditional
Mhm.
publishing. Good luck.
Thank
Dan?
you.
This is something I've been giving a lot of thought to. So for the first book, I did a blog tour. And for anyone who might not know what that is, essentially there are companies that organize that essentially offer a free advanced reading copy to book bloggers, of which there are many. And I want to take a moment to say the book blogging community on Twitter is incredible. So I found out a lot about what I know about what are people reading in fantasy? What are people liking? What are people really gravitating towards by following and reading book bloggers and interacting with them, etc. So anyway, I booked a blog tour, and I was lucky enough to get literally almost all of my very favorite book bloggers to join, which means essentially that they, within the span of a week, they all post a review. And they were not all, glowing reviews. Most of them were 4-star reviews. There was a 3, there was a 5, which is fine because it shows you that they're actually independently, reviewing the book on its own merits. But that's good because not only does it get potentially some of my followers to see some of these reviews, and it gets me reviews to put on the website, etc., but it also makes other bloggers aware of the book. So I think ultimately the goal is to get as many people as possible aware. So if somebody's like, hey, that sounds interesting, maybe I'll read it and review it, and then maybe their readers will be interested. So I think that's an important thing, but you have to work a long time to get the deep roots and the relationships and the connections to be able to be successful in that way. Other things that I've seen a lot of people do in terms of marketing are art. People do a lot of, especially in fantasy and sci-fi, people do character art. So essentially you hire an artist to do a sketch of a character, and then you do different things with it. You put it on Twitter or Instagram. I haven't yet released them yet. So I'm going to be doing signed book giveaways coming in the coming days. There was one through the blog tour. And then after the signed book giveaways are done, the next thing is I made these character cards. So if anyone's familiar with Magic the Gathering or Pokemon, it's sort of like cards like that with the character and then a little blurb about it. And I'll be doing a Instagram little video where I show myself opening this black velvet bag and then pulling the cards out and showing them one at a time by candlelight. The whole idea is to try different stuff and to not sort of front load everything. So you have the blog tour first, and then after that's faded away, the next you start the signed book giveaway, and when that's faded away, I start the art thing. And I'm already working on the art commission for the next book, so which is going to be something totally different. So really trying to do different stuff that's interesting and eye-catching. And I think art is really, really important. And I think it's probably more important for fantasy and sci-fi maybe than it is for others. But just having somebody see a face as opposed to just you saying, buy my book, it's number whatever on Amazon, can be very helpful in keeping it in people's mind.
Actually, Dan, I have to thank you because I think you posted the link around about the blog tour, and I've just booked one for, in fact, I'll probably do 3 because you never stop marketing the books. So I'll start with the first one and work up, and that's starting in the new year. So
excellent. Do you mind sharing who you, what tour company?
Yes, one second. Let me.
I just wonder because there are different companies that work with different genres, and
it's Storytellers on Tour.
Okay, so you're using I use Storytellers as well.
Yeah.
They're really fabulous people to work with.
Yeah, they knew exactly what they were doing as soon as I contacted them, so that's really cool.
Fantastic, glad to hear it.
Yeah.
Well, it's good to know. How do you balance the time spent marketing your existing books and writing the next one?
I think honestly, for me, it's honestly that I have to have my day very carefully planned out, as I am full-time office employee. I am also on the board of directors of a nonprofit. I have a podcast. I have my writing goals and my development things. And so I basically set aside part of a day to specifically work on promoting things or to start promoting the brand, that sort of thing. And so it's more a matter of, it's as if I'm treating it in the same vein that I do going to the gym to do a running session on the treadmill.
Yeah, I try to split my day, and I'm very much a morning person. So if I'm in a writing phase as opposed to an editing phase, I'll do the writing in the morning and then do the marketing in the afternoon.
I'm in the odd position of I'm working as a consultant with emerging technology anyway. I've got my most recent book actually came out in March, and that was nonfiction. So I'm pushing that for my mainstream publisher alongside them, and then I also run the Sim Cavalier stuff alongside it, and really it's just it's I know sometimes what I'm posting when. But it's more about just being present and people being aware that I do both and being very clear about it in all of my professional stuff.
And I want to add one thing that we think of marketing sometimes as just being like specific actions that you take, but it also is the way that you are on social media. There are a few people on social media who are extremely engaging and interesting, and they may not even post about their writing all that much, but the one example is someone named Louise Willingham, who goes by Lou Writes on Twitter. And she's just so super engaging that when her book went on pre-order, it quickly shot up. And just because she's always there, she's always helpful. She helped me do a little light beta reading. She's always answering people's questions. Her DMs are always open. So having an engaging presence or an interesting presence, or just finding your thing. Like, I thought I would hate Instagram, but I really love taking pictures, little artsy little shots. And I think that eventually over time that, that sort of matters. Some people are going to say, hey, I like the vibe of these pictures. Maybe I like the vibe of the book. So I think a constant, steady, and engaging social media presence can be helpful. I don't know if I do a great job of it, but I certainly try.
To follow up on that, I went to not a panel, a lecture by Kevin J. Anderson, who's of course a very well-known sci-fi author. And he was talking about building your author brand. And he, of course, started out with his example of deciding what sort of clothing he would wear to each author signing, but he broadened it into what kind of behavior or what kind of mannerisms are you going to put out as your public persona. And I decided at the beginning of my publishing career that I was going to be someone who never wrote something on my social media or in my books that my grandmother would be ashamed to read. And so I am someone who holds myself to the standard of, would my grandmother see this as kindness? Would my grandmother think that I was being overly critical or overly sensitive? And it's a great way to kind of set myself apart from the person who I usually am, who unfortunately is a deep-rooted Boston cynic who has a little bit of sarcasm for everything. But I think it is a kind of important, just as much as having character consistency in your book is to have author consistency in how you decide to have your world ethos to be able to interact with people. And it creates kind of a position of trust, and you are able to allow people to approach you more directly and to allow people to trust that they are going to be able to approach you with things that they have questions about, or approach you with any kind of criticism or suggestions, and you may be open to it. Or if you want to be in a completely different vein, you could be the cantankerous old person who refuses to actually like their audience because the art is for you and no one else.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yes, cynical and sarcastic can be a brand if you want it to be. That is allowed. All right, so it looks like we don't have any questions from the audience. So I'm gonna ask the final question, which is, if you could give a writer who wants to write a multi-book series just one piece of advice, what would it be?
Plan the whole thing at the start.
So don't do what you did.
Don't do what I did with my first series. Do what I'm doing with the second series, which is plan it all out and know the ending before you start.
For me, it's, for crying out loud, never write the ending first. because it will always change.
Know what you're aiming for, but maybe don't actually write it out. That's solid advice.
Just keep writing, get to the end of that chapter, and then the trilogy will take care of itself. Don't get blown away by the scale of a project.
I will add, A, strongly consider writing a trilogy, and B, don't be afraid to query small publishers. The experience can be often maybe better in some cases than you might have in traditional publishing situation. Querying is brutal, and if you're out there listening and you've been querying for however long, like I queried for 20 years, never got very far. And when I started reaching out to small publishers, even after I signed, and you had to send out the letter letting everybody else know, like, I've just signed, sorry. I got personal, like, congratulations and good luck from all the small publishers that I reached out to. And I feel like it's the wave of publishing in the future. So reach out to those indie pubs.
Absolutely. Indie publishers are amazing. All right. I think that's all. Thank you guys so much for making this panel wonderful. I hope to see you in the Discord. There will be some discussion around this panel in there. And yeah, hopefully you guys can make some of the other panels too. Thanks again.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
so
Thank
much.
you.
Thanks, Diana.
You've
Bye,
all been
everybody.
lovely. Bye.